oh, XXX Church is just about telling people that porn's bad. And I'm like, no, I mean, that message is 20 years old. If you haven't picked up on that yet, I don't need to spend more time talking about it. So XXX Church is more about what you said. It's our focus is more just talking about all these difficult matters. So sex and porn and masturbation and everything that goes along with it, and just trying to push the envelope and encourage people in church and outside the church to talk about this stuff in a healthy and open way and not avoid it, not shame it, not run from it.
It's time for the Strange O'Clock podcast, where you get to hear strange news with Christian views. Thank you so much for listening to the Strange O'Clock podcast with Michael Basham and Jeralynn Kawewong. And we have our special co-hostess today, Tori Pedersen. Welcome, Michael and Tori.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Welcome. This is awesome.
Absolutely. It's awesome to have you guys. And of course, 7 years later, we welcome our honored guest, Carl Thomas with XXX Ministries. I had interviewed him once before in 2015, and it's like Back to the Future. Here we are, fast forward to 2022, and so we're happy and honored and blessed to have you on board, Carl. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So if you're not familiar with XXXChurch.com ministries, here is a short bio about Carl. It says Carl Thomas knows what it feels like to feel trapped by crushing shame. He's a former porn addict who's been helping others find freedom for over 10 years. In 2019, he launched Live Free Ministries and created the Live Free community app to provide a safe and supportive community for men who hunger for real freedom. He also launched Live Free Wives, a free support community for spouses. Carl is an ordained pastor, certified neuro health coach, and the CEO of XXXChurch.com. Carl's passion for helping individuals find freedom, peace, and purpose is only matched by his New Jersey directness, love for family, devotion to Philadelphia sports teams, and infatuation with his white Jeep Wrangler. Awesome bio. Welcome, Carl. And I see that you have a new book coming out, When Shame Gets Real. What's that about?
Yeah, that came out actually in February. The topic is, I guess you'd say it's mostly focused on sexual shame, but to be honest, we delve into a lot of stuff that's just dealing with shame in general. So the roots of shame, the effects of shame, how you get past shame, but yes, specifically in terms of sexual conversation, sexual topics, unwanted sexual behaviors, those sorts of things.
Wow, that's awesome. So Carl, refresh our memories and teach us a bit about XXXChurch.com.
Yeah, XXXChurch.com was started, I guess, it was 2002. So I guess it's 20 years old at this point. And it was part of an organization called Fireproof Ministries back in the day. I worked for them as a pastor, and also basically headed up all their small groups programs, their marketing. I was the missions pastor. I wore a lot of hats with them. So back when I talked to you originally, I was working for them full time. And that was, like you said, 7 years ago. Then I left, came back, and then left again for various reasons, and started Live Free Ministries back in 2019. And with Live Free, we didn't start it. We basically acquired the small groups program that I had run for Fireproof. And then we launched an app for men. And then we launched a community for spouses, an online community for spouses. And then in March of last year, we acquired XXX Church. So now XXX Church is part of Live Free Ministries. It's no longer part of Fireproof Ministries. And so we do all of that.
Yeah. Do you guys have so you have an app? Sounds very interesting. Do you guys do like a podcast kind of radio transmission as well?
Well, we have something we call, XXX Church does something called office hours. So that's basically comes out every Friday. I guess you could call it a podcast because it's out on podcasting platforms, but we basically launched it honestly to just answer specific questions people have unique to their situation, because there's certain things you just can't really Google, or you can, but you're probably going to get a variety of bizarre answers. So office hours is one of these things where people submit a question. I answer it on camera. We release it every Friday, and it's 99.9% of the time related to topics of pornography, sex, and masturbation. But we tackle other things too sometimes if they have a question related to relationships. So we have that. That's office hours. Outside of that, we don't really do anything. We've played around with the idea of doing some podcasting stuff eventually. But to be honest, we push out a ton of content for our communities. So that's where our focus is just really leaning into the communities that we already foster and making sure that they have the content they need and the teaching they need. And, if we have the bandwidth to do a podcast down the road beyond office hours, well, maybe we'll do it. But
awesome.
Yeah, certainly let us know. With Fringe Radio Network, we could help promote that as well. So keep us in your notes as far as that goes.
I don't know if this is what you were about to say, but like there's so many facets of this, right? And like how it affects especially believers, how it affects women, how it affects families. And, I was just thinking about like my personal experience with all this, which we could talk about later, but, even the ways that it impacts things like trust and self-worth and insecurities and stuff like that. But I guess my first question would just be like, what initially moved your heart to start ministering in this way?
Well, I mean, it was something that I struggled with myself for 20 years, I guess. I don't know, 17, 20 years. So, and then it's a long story, but basically when I found freedom from all this stuff, XXX Church was part of it. It wasn't necessarily part of it in what you would think of as the traditional sense. I wasn't using their software or involved in one of their programs or anything like that. It was, I actually got involved with them on the missions end when we used to, and we might do it again someday, but when we used to go to porn and sex shows, they hand out Bibles that said Jesus loves porn stars and all that stuff. So I got involved on that end, and through just a weird series of events, which really are God ordained events, but the outsider would just say, wow, that was strangely coincidental. So through a series of weird events, basically, was able to find freedom from all this stuff. And then my involvement with them on a volunteer basis turned into a paid basis, and it's history.
Have you found, because Dan Duvall is doing some podcasts with sex trafficked victims and human trafficking, and have you seen any dovetailing with that as you're going to these events?
Well, we haven't done those shows in a couple of years. We're talking to I'm friends with the guy that runs one of the biggest shows in the U.S. He's a really nice guy. I mean,
wow.
He knows that we don't land on the same page in terms of, in terms of porn and all that. But outside of that, he's a family man.
Really,
a really nice guy. And yeah, we get lunch every once in a while and talk. And so we're talking about re-engaging that aspect of the ministry, but we haven't done that in a while, just because of COVID and everything. And then once we acquired it, we were more focused on the recovery side of things more than anything. So that's just been one of these things kind of outside on the outskirts where it's, well, maybe we'll get back to that someday, but our focus really is more on the recovery aspects.
Carl, we have had so many changes since 2015 for good and bad in society. So the craziness of what's going on in schools and among the young people is that they believe that they could be one of 72 genders, which is outlandish. And it's being pushed by the powers that be, because they're influenced and controlled by the enemy to bring sexual confusion. So do you think that some of these kids or young people or whatever who happen to stumble into porn or whatever, that because of their I guess, education that's twisted about the genders, might start with just regular heterosexual porn, and then as the gateway drug, and then happen to go into all kinds of even more, quote, degenerative porn. Have you seen that? Have you talked to people in these conventions like that seem to kind of start with hetero porn, and then they go into like, more hardcore type of porn that might be, I don't know, like the greater quote of the two evils, have you talked to any people like that?
I mean, yeah, it's, when you get into like gender conversations and sexuality conversations, that's a much bigger topic. And I mean, I'm sure there's some crossover in certain areas, but in terms of just porn addiction in general, it's a pretty well-known truism that your tastes generally will be for harder or more hardcore stuff the longer you're addicted, and simply because you just need to recreate that dopamine boost you get. So as your brain kind of gets numb to the stuff that you used to kind of quote unquote get off on, eventually that novelty wears off, and then your brain needs something else, right, to get that same level of high. And it's like that with any drug or behavior. Gambling would be a similar thing where you're talking about a behavioral addiction versus a quote unquote chemical addiction. And the same thing. I mean, I have a friend who's a reformed gambling addict, and he didn't start off dropping $2,000 at the casino in a night. He started off with smaller stakes, smaller amounts, and then as he continued, hey, I need to bet more, I need to wager more, and the payoff needs to be bigger to really create that same high, that same thrill, right? And so it's very similar with porn, and that's that's not just pretty well-known fact, but it's also stuff that people, whether it's at the shows or the people in our communities, I mean, it's a pretty similar story. They started off with something, and now they're doing this, and before you know it, they're doing strip clubs and escorts, and and then it goes from there.
Yes, I know addiction, any type of addiction, whether it's gambling or sexual addiction or what have you, it always starts with a gateway drug. Whereas, like, for example, people might say, oh, I'm just, like people out in the world, or even Christians that aren't convicted about porn or whatever, they might say, oh, I just watch porn to get off or what have you. And it won't progress to anything more. But what you had just said, that people are inclined to the greater and greater levels of depravity because of the dopamine high. So whatever excited a person maybe 5 years ago isn't the same thing as it is now, because they're looking to create that same dopamine high when they first saw porn. And it might start off with heterosexual porn, and then it might slide the slope down to homosexual porn, and then bondage porn, and God knows what else. I know that unfortunately Ted Bundy started off with porn, and I'm not saying that most people will become a Ted Bundy or a Jeffrey Dahmer or what have you, but it always starts somewhere. What would you say to those Christians who think that it's just benign and innocuous and innocent?
Well, I mean, if you're dealing with Christians specifically, I mean, deal with a non-Christian who doesn't think porn is a big deal. It's understandable, because their worldview is different in terms of what they think of as in and out of bounds when it comes to sexuality. But with a Christian who you would think would have a biblical worldview, would understand God's purpose for marriage and all that stuff, and they still think porn's okay, I'd say most of the time, usually they don't really. They're just looking for some sort of, they're trying to rationalize it. We get questions all the time to the office hours thing that I was talking about, where guys ask, hey, my wife hasn't had sex with me in 5 years. Is it okay if I masturbate and look at porn? Because I got to do something, and it's better than cheating on her, right? So that's like the rationalization. So I would say with those guys, the reason they're asking the question is because, or women, it's not just a men's thing, but anybody, I think a lot of times they're looking for excuses to do it, because deep down inside, they don't feel good about it. But for those that think it's perfectly fine, I'd say, well, on on a biblical basis, if you want to go biblical, maybe read your Bible, and you'll probably see that that doesn't really pan out. But if you want to stay away from the theological conversation, which I understand because that can get very heavy, and sometimes, people's perspectives on sexuality, biblical sexuality, can vary from person to person. Sometimes what people call biblical sexuality isn't biblical at all. But I would say from a practical standpoint, it's just, okay, hey, let's talk about this from just forget the wrong and right of it. What are you doing? Why are you doing it? Is it something you can walk away from? How's it affecting your relationships? Is it something you tend to run to when you have problems or have negative emotions? And it's like, is that your escape? Because if you're using porn or anything else to deal with difficulties in life or difficult emotions, that's just not healthy. We have to learn how to handle our emotions in a healthy way. Not be afraid to dig sometimes when we notice some pain there, and try to figure out why and cope with that in a proper manner. But a lot of times it's just easier to go with something like porn because it feels good. Our brain loves it. And it kind of numbs out all the stuff we're dealing with.
Right. Absolutely.
Conversation, but what about like deliverance? Have you guys had any experience with like casting out demons of like different perverted things that? Oh, no. Okay. So you guys don't really do that. Okay.
No.
Just asking. No. What's like the most effective way that you've seen people break away from porn addictions?
It all starts with I would say it all starts with the community. You need to open up and talk about this stuff and have people in your life that you can share these struggles with, so you can kind of walk through it together. It all starts there. And then, yes, you need to bring in other things. You got to learn about the nature of what you're dealing with. You got to probably, in most cases, I'd say, see a counselor, because a counselor is going to help you deal with some of the past pains and traumatic events that are often lying behind the reason you use this stuff in the first place. But I've talked to guys they've done the workshops, they read the books, they've even done the counselor, but they still struggle to find real success. And the one thing that's always missing is that they're not talking to anybody about it. They're trying to do this thing solo. And you just can't do that. You can't do this thing by yourself. That's just not the way just doesn't work. And honestly, biologically speaking, it makes sense, because when you really dig down into the nitty gritty about addiction and the role of fear and all these different things in our life, it all comes down to the fact that we are mammals, and mammals need groups, right? Whether you're human or a water buffalo, mammals need groups. We're designed that way because the group makes us feel safe. The group makes us feel loved and normal and at ease. And so when we're outside on our own, we feel very alone. We feel very exposed, and yeah, you're not going to be able to navigate to a place of real health if you constantly feel like you're under some sort of threat.
Very good answer. Wow. Well, I'm going to head out. You guys have a great talk. I'm going to listen to this, and we can't wait to promote what you're doing. And I know that as we go into the future, there's going to be new technology that's going to make this stuff even more accessible, and people are going to be more alone, more isolated, and it's going to be like a zombie movie or something with all these demons. So thank you so much, sir. Now I'll be listening in, and thank you, Jerry, and nice to meet you, Tori.
Thanks, Michael, for stopping by.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I just wanted to ask you, because I know the ministry is mainly focused on recovery, after people have already fallen into this, but having grown up in the church, and having been, having had struggled with this and things like this, and having been in relationships with people who struggle like this, it's like, I wonder, why do you think that the church, and I know this isn't an easy question because I thought about this too, but why do you think the church has such a hard time talking about sex? Why do you think that Christians are so scandalized by sexual sins? So we don't talk about it at all, really. And I feel like you said, accountability, I think accountability is really the best way, and like a biblical way to fight these sorts of things. But it's like, we really can't have accountability when everything is such a secret, and it has to stay a secret, because if anyone in church found out that anyone else in church was a sinner, it would be a huge scandal, you know? So I guess that's just my question. Like, why do you think Christians are so unwilling even to admit to other Christians that like we have sin in our lives, you know?
Yeah, that's like a 12-hour answer probably, but I'll try to keep it simple. Well, first of all, just so you know, when I say we're focused on recovery, I'm saying from a ministry perspective. So like the organization, our goal is to get people to a place of sexual health, if you will, right? Out of these really destructive habits that are ruining their lives. How we do that is a whole different story. So yes, we have like Live Free and small groups online where basically our entire focus is this is a resource or this is a community or whatever that's going to help you. XXX Church, on the other hand, is more about, and I don't like to use the word awareness because then that brings about this whole other idea of, you know, oh, XXX Church is just about telling people that porn's bad. And I'm like, no, I mean, that message is 20 years old. If you haven't picked up on that yet, I don't need to spend more time talking about it. So XXX Church is more about what you said. It's our focus is more just talking about all these difficult matters. So sex and porn and masturbation and everything that goes along with it, and just trying to push the envelope and encourage people in church and outside the church to talk about this stuff in a healthy and open way and not avoid it, not shame it, you know, not run from it. That drives me nuts that's kind of the culture that we find ourselves in. And, you know, we did an event called Shameless. It's an online event. It's actually an event that we offer for churches, but we did an event called Shameless in September. And a lot of the content we talk about in that event came from the book, When Shame Gets Real, which I wrote. And that was the whole focus of the event was, hey, how do we have these conversations in these different circles we find ourselves in a healthy way? Back in the day, XXX Church's big event used to be called Porn and Pancakes, right? We were the first ones that came out with the idea. And now you see a bunch of churches throughout the nation ripping off the name because they think it's edgy now. It's not edgy. It's 20 years old. But regardless, that used to be the event. And it was a good event. I had been to several of them, but it was kind of, the format was a bit played out, in my opinion, at this point, where it was just a talking head gets up there and he talks about the problems of pornography. And the message was simple. You know, this is a problem. If you struggle with it, you have a problem. You need to get some help. Go get some help. All right. And then they come into church, they do their big thing, and then they leave and nothing changes. Nothing ever changes. Right. It's just a bunch of guys show up, they hear the message, they say, wow, that's great. And then they go home and now they're on the football and they forgot all about that event. Right. So we said, no more porn and pancakes. So we shut that down. And that's when we came up with the idea of Shameless, which is, hey, let's back the horse up a few steps, right? So the cart's no longer in front of it, or let's move the horse up a few steps rather. So the cart's no longer in front of it. And let's tackle the real problem, which is that we don't talk about this stuff, right? So if we can talk about this stuff in a healthy way, then people are going to feel more free to seek help if they need it, because it's not a shameful thing anymore. It's just a fact of life. And the title or the subtitle for the event was Shameless, Normalizing the Sex, Porn, and Sex and Porn Conversation. And sometimes when people hear that, you know, they look at you like, what? Normalize? Like, there's nothing normal about it. And normalizing doesn't mean excusing it or saying it's okay or saying it's healthy. It's just admitting what we already know and don't want to admit. It's pretty normal, right? Nobody feels weird, or most people, I'm not going to say nobody, but most people don't feel weird going to their church small group and saying, hey, I put on a few pounds during the holidays. I think I need to join the gym, right? Likewise, a lot of people, you would think it'd be the opposite, but a lot of people don't have a problem admitting they're check to check and they're struggling financially, right? You'll hear it in the prayer request. Yeah, we're having a tight month. We need to do this and that. And, oh, yeah, we'll pray for you, right? No problem there, because we all understand it's normal. Being overweight, out of shape, relatively normal for the U.S. citizen, right? Being in debt, having your credit cards maxed out, living check to check, unfortunately, pretty dang normal, right? Not good, normal. And same thing here, right? Masturbating, looking at porn, having sexual struggles with your spouse because you both don't know how to approach that conversation, right? Having parents who refuse to talk to their kids about these things at a young enough age because they're afraid about it. It's all normal, right? It's not good, but it's normal. So like, let's just get over ourselves and just admit it. Hey, yeah, this is normal. Right? Most people have masturbated or have thought about masturbating or have at least talked about masturbation on some level, right? Most people have had sex, want to have sex, or regret having sex, right? I mean, it's just the way it is. It doesn't mean it's a good thing, but it is a thing. And we need to understand that. And then if we can get through that, talk about it, not demonize this stuff, not shame this stuff, but just admit it, then, you're going to see healthier conversations and you're going to see people more willing to step up and say, yeah, you know what? This is something I want to get on track in my life. And it's not, oh my gosh, did you hear Bob that he looks at porn? It's like, oh yeah, Bob looks at porn. Joe eats too much. And Tim can't seem to manage his finances. It's just another problem in the potpourri of problems we see as a society and as a church. It's not anything unique or special. It's just a problem, and we got to work with it.
Right. Great question, Tori. I have a story that I wanted to share. So our pastor from our church years ago, I would say in 2007 or 2008, had a sermon on this very problem. And he had a montage of different quasi porn or very hard PG-13 or R images, just in regular commercials and TV and movies and what have you. And he was basically showing what a kid or adult will see in like maybe an hour or two of television. And so he just took snippets of these different aforementioned media, and he showed the congregation. And I would have to say there were people that complained to the pastor saying that they were never going to return back to the church, or just complained saying that they'll continue going to the church, but will not support them financially, or just complained. I would say a lot of the older folks had said that they didn't feel like it was appropriate to show in church. And so anyway, that's a piggyback to what Tori had asked. That was a great question. There's a huge stigma about sex, basically, still within Christianity. And a lot of people still to this day, they kind of skip over the Song of Solomon or whatever, or they get embarrassed and red-faced or whatever when it comes to talking about sex. And it absolutely must be talked about, because the divorce rate, even among the Christians, is at an all-time high, whatever, I'm not sure, 50, 60, 70%, or probably at least 60% of Christian marriages end in divorce. And it's usually because it starts off as looking at porn and then connecting with another man or another woman online via Facebook or in a chat room or whatever. And then they meet, and then there's an affair, and then there's multiple affairs, and that man or woman becomes sexually addicted, and then there's a divorce. It happens all the time, even among Christians. And that's why obviously the scriptures state, to submit to God, to resist the enemies, and he'll flee. And so there's all these kinds of strongholds over people's minds, because it starts off with the gateway drug, like I said, porn. So anyway, that was the story I wanted to share about our brave and courageous pastor who brought this up, and to the chagrin of some of the older folks. So what would you tell some of the older folks that are really super conservative in terms of this topic, at least, who just say, this shouldn't be talked about at church? I mean, it was kind of a similar question to what Tori had asked, but what would you tell these folks that say, well, this is inappropriate to talk about at church?
Well, I know you're supposed to respect your elders, but
yes, absolutely.
The reality is, they're the reason we're here, and then their parents are the reason they were there. It's got to change. So why do you see so many 30, 40, 50-year-old men and women who are dealing with sexual struggles of some sort? And let's not just limit it to porn. Again, it could be masturbation. It could just be, hey, maybe we're not maybe there is no infidelity going on within a marriage, but we just don't get along, right? We're not there for each other. We don't talk. We have, and a lot of the resentment that's building up between them has to do with sex, right? It has to do with a lack of intimacy, those sorts of things, right? It doesn't always have to be infidelity. It could just be, I don't feel intimate or connected to my wife. Hey, I don't feel like my husband really respects me or wants me for who I am. He just wants me for sex. Like, it's those sorts of things, right? And it's because a lot of us grew up in houses, in churches that don't want to talk about it, right? That say it's inappropriate. And the reason they grew up that way is because their parents did the same thing. And it's not going to change unless we change it. So, I mean, you can pretend that a problem is not a problem if you want, but that doesn't really work out too well. You can be an ostrich and put your head in the dirt, but it doesn't mean the lion's not going to come along and rip you to pieces. You gotta just grow up and say, hey, listen, we got to talk about this stuff. I know it makes me uncomfortable, but that's okay. Last time I checked, this is like a nightmare for any student, a grammar or English teacher, but nothing worth anything doesn't come with some sort of level of discomfort. Right. It's just, absolutely. That's the case, right? That's why when I think I talked about this maybe in the book, I don't remember, but I know I've said this before, but that's why when you go to the gym, there's always that one dude, especially, I mean, I know it's the dudes, but you've seen them coming to the gym for 10 years or maybe not 5 years, right? They're usually the older guy, got a big belly, doesn't look like he's worked out a day in his life, does the same machines every week. He's lifting the same weights that he lifted 10 years ago or 5 years ago. It's like, why isn't the guy, he's showing up at the gym every day, he's putting in the time. Why doesn't he look any healthier than he did 5 years ago? Because he's not pushing himself. He's not challenging himself. He's, this is easy. He does that. Then he sits there and talks to his cronies for the next hour. Then he does another set. Like, there's no discomfort. There's no challenge. You have to push yourself to grow.
The whole thing with church, it just seems so silly because it's like every time you show up on Sunday, it's like you're admitting that, you're there to worship God, right? Like, because we need God. It's like, we'll admit, oh, we need God. But it's like, well, why do you need God? Because you're a sinner. It's like, if we didn't have any sins in our life, then we wouldn't need to keep going to church. It'd be like, oh, you're healed. It's like, okay, I guess you graduated. Like, you don't need salvation anymore, So it's like, we admit that we need salvation, but we're not willing to admit why, and so.
Yeah, I remember I got a comment. I don't have it in front of me, so I can't read it to you. So I can just give you the bylines, but I wrote a blog post for XXXCHURCH a couple of weeks ago. I mentioned in the podcast, got what I said exactly, but something along the lines of, the church should be leading in these areas of conversations. We should be leading in conversations about sex and sexuality in a healthy way too, not in a condemning way or a, hey, let's scare the crap out of you way, but just in a healthy way. We should be leading these conversations. But what happens is we end up following, right? We are always the last one to the party. And then, we're just trying to get our comments in there so we're heard, but we're never leading. And, the reality is someone's going to lead this conversation one way or the other. So if it's not us, it's going to be somebody else. And chances are that somebody else that's going to want to lead these conversations is not going to lead them in a direction that we want to go in. Right. And so, some woman, I think it was a woman, it sounded like a woman, left a comment, like a long comment about how she couldn't get through the blog post and she thinks it's ridiculous. And why would we ever talk about this in church? And isn't this just a gateway to pornography and lust? And just crazy is the word. And I'm reading this reply, thinking to myself, wow, all I replied was, hey, let's just agree to disagree. Like, I wasn't going to get involved in anything, but it's like, you're nuts. What are you talking about? We shouldn't be talking about this stuff. And Absolutely. She even said how her pastor said, I think a lot of pastors have it right. We don't need to talk about sex because that just opens up the door. Okay. All right. And that's worked out really well, hasn't it? Yeah.
That's what I was going to ask. Like, well, how's that working for you?
Yeah, not at all.
Not at all. Yeah. Gosh. And it also just like, I don't know. Of course, we're not relatable in the church to the world. You know what I mean? Of course, they look at us and they think like, oh, these people see themselves as up on a pedestal. Like, they think they're too holy to talk about sex. I don't know. It's just like we are all humans, and I don't know. It's like, you hope, as we grow in our faith, it's like, yeah, the Holy Spirit is working in our lives and, like regenerating what I mean? But like, we're still people. We're not better than, anyway, like, not too good to talk about that stuff. I'm sitting here and I'm flipping through, the Ragamuffin Gospel by Brennan Manning. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. Jeralynn, I talk about Brennan Manning or Rich Mullins all the time. Yeah. Cause it just had like such a profound impact on my faith. But Brennan Manning writes a lot about struggling with like alcoholism and going to AA. And he just has the most profound things to say about like God's grace, and it's like, I would never have heard those stories or have this understanding of the gospel the way that I do if he wasn't willing to get real about like the dirty stuff in his life and like how God loved him through it and met him there, and like it's called the Ragamuffin Gospel, but it's basically talking about all of our, like unworthiness and neediness, like before the throne of God and how he loves us anyway, like crazily, like so much.
Awesome.
Yeah. So he has this quote. It's actually from a different book, but he says, in a futile attempt to erase our past, we deprive the community of our healing gift. If we conceal our wounds out of fear and shame, our inner darkness can neither be illuminated nor become a light for others. So I just think about that too. It's like Christians who aren't willing to talk about this stuff, like if you have struggled, if God has like shown up for you anyway, it's kind of like, man, no one else gets to hear that story of God's grace because you're not willing to talk about having a problem,
Absolutely. I saw a movie that was a biopic about Rich Mullins, David Rich Mullins, and it was called The Ragamuffin Story or The Ragamuffin Gospel. Was there any connection with that book?
Yeah, totally. So Rich Mullins, is one of my heroes. Well, my mom played like his cassette tapes when I was little. And then I went through some like
awesome
dark times in college. And it was just kind of one of those, when you're stressed and you eat comfort food, like when you were little, like a PB&J, I was like, I had this comfort music. And
oh, wow.
Yeah,
that's great.
So started listening to his music and I was like, he's another example of a Christian who's willing to like talk about the dark stuff that a lot of people aren't really, like being depressed, having problems, and he was like deeply influenced by Brennan Manning. They were actually friends in real life.
Wow.
So yeah, and so he identified, I think he actually wrote like the foreword in this book, but he kind of embodied like the Ragamuffin spirit. So that was the name of his movie. Yeah, there's lots of Brennan Manning interactions in that movie too. So
I'll have to rewatch that movie. That was a great movie, and I'll have to check out that book, Ragamuffin Gospel. I've heard about the book a little bit, but I definitely watched the movie for sure. And I know that Rich Mullins has passed on and with the Lord now and everything. It was an amazing story that really shines a light on people struggling with depression and alcoholism and different things. And I think that the power of story is really amazing and really effective, I think, in reaching people, especially, when Carl, shares that he himself struggles with it, has struggled, is struggling, as we all do. And so when somebody like Carl comes forth and says, look, I've struggled with this since age whatever, since 19 whatever, and that gives hope to men and realizing, look, I'm not somebody that should be shamed, somebody that needs to just hold it in and pretend like everything's okay, that when they realize that the Lord wants to reach everybody, no matter what they're struggling with, I think people will come out of the shadows and feel more comfortable. This was a story that I shared with Carl in 2015. So at this church that my husband and I were going to, I wanted to step forward and teach from that book, Every Woman's Battle by Shannon Etheridge, who's one of my heroines. And she went to Liberty, and she has, I believe, a master's in psychology or MSW, I forget. Anyway, so she wrote this book, Every Woman's Battle, which was an adjunct to Every Man's Battle by Stephen Arterburn. I don't know if you all have heard of that book, but anyway, I wanted to teach from this book at this church that I went to, and there were women that would secretively call the church and ask, "What is this book about?" And oh, okay, oh, interesting. What are and they wouldn't call back or whatever. So they called because they were struggling, but they didn't want to show up at the teaching on Thursday night at 7:30 or whatever, to show their face, because it could be the pastor's wife. It could be some, they just didn't want to come forward out of the shadows, because then when you put a face and a name to a struggle, then there's shame attached to it. So it's awesome that you have this book, Carl, because when shame gets real, so they should hopefully after reading this book and going to the website, hopefully after listening to this podcast, they should see that this is not something abnormal and unusual. Everybody struggles. The scriptures state that all of us are tempted, all of us struggle, that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, etc. And so the enemy is always trying to tempt us and seduce us and lure us with our weaknesses, whether it's sex, drugs, alcohol, or whatever. But anyway, so a question that I wanted to veer to, Carl, was so there's women who found out their husbands or boyfriends have this addiction to porn. Maybe they're on a mutual computer, maybe a wife or a girlfriend looks through her boyfriend or husband's phone and is shocked by what she's seen. And so this is what I mentioned the last time, was that, which I wanted to bring up again. So a lot of women, when they discover that their husbands or boyfriends have been looking at porn, and they're thinking that they're inferior or inadequate in some way, shape, or form. What would you tell those women, or what would you tell those men who found out that their wives or girlfriends have this issue?
Well, it's two different things. I think the woman question is actually important, because the men, depending on the man, he may or may not be ready to deal with his issues. I always say it's better. I'm not the one that said this, but it's always better to have something brought, not caught, right? And a lot of times, guys end up getting into recovery because they got caught, mostly because when they get caught, all of a sudden the stakes are tangible, right? If I don't take care of this, I could lose my marriage, I could lose my kids, I could lose my job, whatever. So sometimes it takes getting caught, but it's always better when they're the ones that bring forth that information, because it means now they're ready to be vulnerable and deal with this stuff. But whether the guy's ready or not, the woman is still going to be in pain. And I think what spouses need to understand is that while it's understandable that they feel betrayed, and they have been betrayed, and it's understandable that they think it may be about them, or it's something that their husband needs more than what they're providing or whatever. That's just simply not the case in general, right? I mean, it is a betrayal, don't get me wrong, but it's not so much, it's almost not at all about, oh, you're not good enough looking, or you're not enough for me, or I need this, or I need that, right? It's way deeper stuff. And again, you're dealing usually with emotional pain and all sorts of things that are causing this particular person to act out sexually. And it could be anything, but in their case, it happens to be sexually, how they kind of deal with that stuff, right? And that's why when you see younger guys who think that once they get married, it's all going to get better, they're shocked when not only doesn't it get better, but sometimes it gets worse, even though now they're in a marriage where they can, in theory, have sex without guilt, without being sinful. And yet they're looking at porn even more. Because, well, why is it? Well, they weren't looking at porn because of the lack of sex. They were looking at porn for some other reason.
Right.
And now that they're married, they've now invited a whole list of other concerns, anxieties, pressures, stressors that they never had before when it was just them. Right now, they have to worry about a wife. They have to worry about a marriage. They have to worry about possibly a mortgage payment. They got all this stuff. Like, life gets real really fast. And now it's, my gosh, I wasn't handling life on a very basic level where it was just me very well. That's why I was going to stuff. Now I have all these other things. So what do you think is going to happen? They're going to go to that stuff even more because they haven't learned how to deal with life in the first place, right? And now it's life times 10. All the pressures and stressors that they used to deal with are amped up. So it's not about the spouse, right? You could, it's like, it's not about the woman, right? It's just not. But again, it's understandable that they feel that way, because of course they feel that way, right? It's sexual. So it makes sense. It's got to be me. No, it's not you. Trust me, it's not you. I know it feels like you. It's going to hurt like that, but it's not you, right? It's them. It's something they got to deal with. And you can be part of that process. But you could do everything in your power it's still not going to make him any better, right? Yeah,
Right.
he's got to go through the recovery process and deal with stuff, and none of that stuff really has anything to do with your looks, your sexual availability, or anything like that.
Right. That sets women free. I think absolutely what you just said, Carl, that it's not due to the women's availability or appearance or what have you. And just like in 2015, you were mentioning that, when you get married, you're young and slim and hot and everything, and it was like, for example, I was 130 pounds when I met my husband, and due to good eating and what have you, I'm, went from the size 6 to a size 10 or 12, and especially during the pandemic when we're all at home, I think I'm a size 12 or 14 in these days. So I'm feeling a little bit inferior, insecure, and what have you, and thinking, okay, I know that sometimes women will be with their husbands somewhere, what have you, and so this is how a woman thinks, like, okay, well, I'm a little bit overweight, I'd like to be size 8 or 6, but I'm like a 12, 14, like M or L size. And here's this, young hot thing or whatever that walks by. And so a woman thinks, oh, is he looking at her? Is he fantasizing about her? Oh, there's a beautiful woman on TV or in the movies or whatever. Does he compare me unfavorably to her or what have you? So it's just one of those things that it's like a mental torture, I think, for a woman to think that, oh, my husband is looking at other women because of an inadequacy, with my appearance or what have you, or vice versa. It absolutely is freeing to know that.
We have a hard time understanding this, and because it's so much of it is it's sensitive, right? Like it hurt. No one wants to admit this, but the reality is there's nothing wrong with attraction, right? We all are attracted to the things we're attracted to. And we have very little, if you will, control over what we're attracted to, right? A lot of that is built up through past experiences and all sorts of things. Like we're attracted to whatever we're attracted to. But just because you're attracted to something doesn't mean you want to be with that person. Or just because you're attracted to someone doesn't mean you want to be with that person, right?
Right.
I'm married. I'm happily married. I love my wife. She knows I love her. Am I going to? She knows that there's women out there who are attractive, right? It's not that if I see a woman and I think to myself, she's attractive, that doesn't mean she's attractive. I'm going to ditch my wife, right? It's like,
absolutely,
okay,
right.
She's physically appealing. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, if I go beyond that and start objectifying her and fantasizing, like that's messed up, right? That's not good.
Right.
But if it's just an acknowledgement of, hey, that's a beautiful woman, doesn't mean really anything in terms of our marriage, because if not that I'm saying you have that option, but I don't want to leave my wife just because I see an attractive woman. My wife offers me a lot more than just how she looks in a dress, right?
Absolutely.
Hopefully your marriage is grounded on more than just the aesthetics.
Yes, absolutely. This is the last thing I'll say about this topic. There's the 80-20 rule. So a lot of men and women have their needs approximately met by their spouse, like 80% of it. 80% of their needs are met by their spouse, but there's that fixation on the 20%. Like, for example, my husband doesn't really like to talk very much, and he's an introvert. I'm an extrovert. And sometimes, I think to myself, oh, it would be great if, he was more talkative and chatty and what have you. And then maybe somebody else might have that quality. But that's the 20%. So if you leave somebody for what your spouse doesn't have, then you'll get the 20%, but you will have ditched the 80%, if that makes any sense. Or the percentages could be completely different. It could be 90-10, could be 60-40, what have you. But whatever a person might be tempted to leave their spouse for, it's a bad situation altogether. I can't tell you how many, what was the statistic? The first marriages that ended divorce is 50%. The second marriages are, the percentage of divorce is like 60%, and the third is 70%. Up. It goes up. It's the law of diminishing value or what have you. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but people are, they think because they don't have the Lord in their life, or they haven't had the Lord heal that emptiness or woundedness in their heart, to try to find their wholeness in somebody else, and then that person doesn't meet their needs, and they go after somebody else, and they keep looking for that 20%, and they're never going to be satisfied with it, because somebody's going to come up short after the honeymoon stage of 6 months to 2 years, someone's going to come up short with not meeting your needs, and then then on to the next. And that's why you have people getting married 3, 4, 5, 6 times. I'm not trying to judge them, but that's just the state of the human condition. We're always looking for something we don't have eventually, after the high wears off of 6 months to 2 years after the honeymoon stage. But anyway, I'll stop blathering.
I don't know. Yeah, I just, coming from the perspective of, I'm young and single, and so it's just like this stuff. I mean, it does like freak me out. I feel like for girls, like, well, and guys, I don't know, everybody, it's like my experiences with this have like created this fierce need to like always be as perfect as I can. You know what I mean? Like, can like never be unattractive even for like a minute, because this is such a, you know what I mean? I don't know. Like, I guess just having had like my eyes open to that. Well, I can just tell you the story, I guess, or like my first interaction with this. I was like 19 and very naive, like going to a Christian college, dating my Christian boyfriend. And it was like he opened his laptop to show me something, and, and like we were really close. I didn't think we had like secrets. And then, this thing popped up. And so it was kind of like, anyway, it kind of like broke my brain, because I was like, I didn't know this was a thing. I didn't, like I said, very naive, but it just created this like this deep insecurity you've talked about, like I'm not enough, I'm not pretty enough, but also like I was taking the purity thing pretty seriously, and so I was like, oh, well, like I'm trying to be pure, we're trying to be pure, but then it's like you're doing this thing, like in your heart with like other women, so like that betrayal factor. But anyway, so it just trying to undo that thought of like, well, I have to like meet those needs, or else like I'm going to get cheated on, or like no guy's going to like stay with me if I'm not like doing stuff I shouldn't be doing. You know what I mean? So I don't know. That's just like another aspect of it, I guess, kind of for like single people, like single Christians, feeling like, oh, I have to compete with this because like I know it's out there,
Well, thank you so much, Tori, for sharing the struggle. I definitely understand the struggles, thinking that, oh, I've got to look, I've got to be a size 6 or 4, whatever, size C, what have you, in order to keep my husband's attention. Tori, thank you so much for sharing your candid story. Well, my story is that, unfortunately, I didn't have the luxury of naivety at age 8. Somebody in my household, unfortunately, had a huge, big box stash of porn. And that was in the early 80s, and there were magazines upon posters, upon leaflets or pamphlets, and what have you. So I stumbled upon this, unfortunately, when I was 8, and it really seared my mind. I wasn't told about the birds and the bees or any sex ed classes or what have you, which I don't really think I should have had any necessarily sex ed classes until maybe age 12, not like the kids nowadays that have it rammed down their throat, proverbially speaking, when they're super young. But anyhow, I was baptized by slime mentally and visually when I was 8, and this person in my family unfortunately had this box around because that person was, and perhaps still, addicted to porn, and hence it really caused my life trajectory to skew even as a Christian. So I was promiscuous, unfortunately, starting at age 13, and then I became a Christian at age 16, and then I wanted a secondary virginity, and I did so for several years, but then I slipped back into it a few times before my ex-husband and after my ex-husband, but I've been married happily ever since 2003 and have been together with my husband since 2001. Of course, we have our ups and downs, but it is always a struggle of mine, and it has been since, I would say, age 11. And at age 11, my friend said, "Oh, Jerry, you've got to call this sexy phone number." So it was like a sex hotline, basically, of a recorded woman's voice. And she was talking about all these sexual things that she would do to the caller, who would be presumably male. And so unfortunately I called it, and my friends and I, we were oogling and oohing and ahhing to what this woman with the sexy voice was saying to whoever was calling it. So those were the days. If you're super young, you will not remember this, but those were the days when men would pay maybe like $4 a minute, or some ungodly amount per minute to call this recorded number. Or it could be a live sexy operator who would describe what she would do to the caller, and it was graphic and sexual in nature, of course. So anyhow, I wish I was naive, like Tori said she was, until age 19, when she saw that unfortunate stuff on her ex-boyfriend's laptop. So I think a lot of women need to really stare this in the face and not be ignorant of any longer, that if you have a husband or if you have a boyfriend, more than likely he's addicted to porn. He's seen porn or is addicted to porn. There are some men, I would say a small percentage of them, that are not addicted to porn. They have other struggles, but don't struggle with porn. And I give them kudos, absolutely. But the majority of men and some women, such as myself, have struggled with it. So it's just something that is a challenge for a lot of men and some women, such as myself, because it's a door, unfortunately, that's opened in one's mind that, okay, well, these scenarios and images are what you need to feel excited and what have you. So a lot of men and some women are addicted to it because of the dopamine high. So dopamine is a substance in one's brain that is elicited when you have pleasure, or it basically causes pleasure, and also gets elicited when you have a pleasurable thing that has happened to you. So anyway, so people get addicted to that dopamine. That's why people are addicted to drugs, people are addicted to sex, people are addicted to porn, masturbation, etc., because they like this excited feeling. But of course, Jesus offers deliverance and freedom from this, and he and accountability friends and partners are able to help you to be able to nip this in the bud, or help you when you feel like you're going to stumble or struggle. Anyway, so I just wanted to share that with you. What I found is that, beautiful women that are actresses, they have their husbands cheat on them all the time, and they're divorcing all the time, and they're supposed to be the epitome of beauty, right? J-Lo, Christy Brinkley, and what have you. I know Christy Brinkley's husband cheated on her for sure, and she's like, to me, like the epitome of like beauty, the old school model there. And well, she doesn't look old, of course, but like, okay, if her husband's cheating on her, it has nothing to do with her beauty or her appearance, that shows you 100% it's the man's issue. But anyway, thank you so much, Carl and Tori and Michael, whenever you hear this, for being on the Strange O'Clock podcast to talk about this very important and timely subject. Carl, what's the website again, and how do they get a hold of you?
Well, you can go to XXXChurch.com. That's easy to remember. And on their homepage there's links to pretty much everything we offer. So, whether it's our small groups program, our app, the book, everything is available right there on the homepage. That's probably the easiest place to direct somebody. But if you're just interested in the book, then it's the title.com, right? WhenShameGetsReal.com. And you can order the book right off the website there. So either one of those is good, and probably the best way to get a hold of us.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carl. It's definitely a timely and important subject for everybody. And again, thank you so much for listening, folks, to the Strange O'Clock podcast with Tori and Michael and our awesome special guest, Carl Thomas. And please check out his book, WhenShameGetsReal.com. Also go to XXXChurch.com, XXXCHURCH.com, and you'll find a lot of resources and accountability technology and things like that for your cell phone and laptop and what have you.